Thank you so much, Scarlett, and it's a great honor to share these tools, I think, with the coalition. And I'm just going to share my screen with you all. Here we go. All right, so I think I'm going to be very brief. I can be very long, unfortunately. There's a lot here, but I think I'm going to give the basic highlights. So if there is more in-depth questions, I think after the session, I will take them. But ultimately, I think what we're running into in organizations and in other places is that organizations are saying, well, we would like to know how we benchmark in terms of our own ethical culture, as well as unethical conduct in our organizations. So where are we? Are we at high risk? Are we at low risk? Do we have a strong culture, ethical culture, or a weak ethical culture? And it's all good and well to run surveys and obtain raw data from the organization. But that's not really useful. What is useful is when you're able to benchmark this data to a sector or to a very large sample of organizations and say, well, you are above average or below average in comparison to these. So what we have been developing over the years, and this is actually the culmination of, I think, over 7 years of work at the Ethics Institute, including additional work that was done before my arrival when I came in on the South African Business Ethics Survey. And this is now a truly international survey. It's no longer just a South African survey, although this is where it was ultimately validated. And we developed two surveys. One is called the Ethical Culture Maturity Indicator, or ECMI for short, and it provides a measurement of the ethical cultural climate of the organization through the eyes or lens of the employees. It is strongly based on the most prominent constructs identified in the research literature on culture, counterproductive work behavior, especially the work of Paul Spector and their colleagues, as well as Linda Trevino, who really looked very closely at how do you evaluate organizational culture? What are the building blocks that are required for that culture to thrive ultimately? And as Paul Spector says, the best individual to ask that from are those that are embedded within that culture, which are employees. And they provide quite a bit of good insight into what's going on in their organization anonymously, which can then allow us to understand that climate and that culture very well. And so what we currently are on is a normed survey that allows you to benchmark your results in the public, private, and state-owned enterprise sector with about 54,709 employees within that norm sample across approximately 110 organizations in each of these categories, and still growing. It has a structure whereby we rank your level of ethical culture maturity. So that 1738 structure is there's one single dimension, one single ranking for you that provides you with an overall rank on culture, either mature, fragile, developing, etc. And it also provides 7 sub-dimensions of culture, which I will quickly speak about very, very quickly. These are the sort of building blocks of culture that keep coming up in the literature. And it also provides item level ranking. So this is at the actual question level. And of course, this is not a tool that was developed lightly. We used exploratory factor analysis, confirmatory factor analysis, exploratory structural equation modeling, and we also did very good reliability analysis on the survey to determine whether or not it can consistently measure these things using a small amount of items or questions. So you ultimately get a rank on a percentile, and this particular organization scored more in the mature category. They obtained a 76th percentile, which means that they have a more mature ethical culture than approximately 76% of the norm sample to whom they are compared. Obviously, there are still a small percentage of organizations that have done better than this organization. In this case, approximately 24% of them did better, but this organization is relatively mature. We do see some others which are far lower than this. These are the dimensions that are used. They are also ranked, which provide us with a very interesting insight into the organization itself, from the degree to which employees talk about right and wrong or discuss ethics, whether they're aware of what is expected of them in terms of ethical conduct and culture and codes, whether there is consistent accountability in the organization, whether they trust their leadership, whether they feel that they are treated ethically, which is considered to be in the literature the most important dimension in either increasing or reducing unethical conduct. So just treat your people better, and suddenly they stop engaging in counterproductive work behavior, and other variables that we include. So you can see for this organization, there were about 4 areas that they could look at and build into their ethics strategy and manage going forward. So it provides a targeted way of actually understanding your culture and improving it over time. The second instrument that we've been working on is something called the Ethics Behaviour Risk Indicator. This is a conduct frequency indicator where we're asking employees anonymously how often they observe unethical conduct in the organization and what types of unethical conduct they observe. And they are quite honest in their responses. So we get quite a bit of insight into the most common factors of counterproductive work behavior. I will share what that means in just a quick second. And this one has a slightly smaller norm, but it is becoming more popular. 48,754 employees across 75 organizations in both state-owned, public, and private sectors. It has a 1784 structure, so 84 questions or items, again, 7 dimensions. I think 7 is an interesting number, keeps coming up, and then a single ranking. And you can see here, this is an organization that scored at the 91st percentile. It's the same organization that we did culture for earlier, which means that unethical behavior is observed very, very infrequently in this particular situation. They've actually got lower unethical conduct frequency as observed by employees than approximately 91% of the sample to whom they are compared. So quite a good score. Again, it's not always this great for many organizations. These are the kinds of dimensions we measure. We operate on the assumption that employees know what others are doing in the organization, and we ask them whether they observe conflicts of interest, people bypassing rules, procedures, codes, etc. in the organization, whether there's good client relations, whether we get back to our clients or customers or the public in the case of public sector organizations, whether there's good employee relations. That would include things like whether employees engage in intimidation, harassment, bullying, that sort of thing, supplier relations, as well as unfair people practices, the degree to which employees feel that they themselves are treated unfairly or inconsistently in the organization, as well as looking at the abuse of organizational resources, whether people are stealing from the organization, abusing organizational time, and so on. So this provides the organization with a percentile rank to see, okay, are we in a bad shape regarding these things, or are we in the top percentile, and are these small occurrences that we might need to manage over time? But this is not where it ends. I think that what we've noticed, especially with ethical culture, is that there are these different variables that tend to overlap into these broader constructs. And so ethical culture is not one of these things. As I mentioned earlier with the ECME, it is where these things come together and they share a lot of variance. So if you actually analyze the data, you start to notice that there is this emerging construct, which we could call culture, right? That is coming out of this, or climate. So we actually looked as well at something quite interesting, and that was whether or not the ethical culture maturity indicator could predict unethical behavior frequency. So instead of giving the organization and its employees 2 surveys, could we give them 1 survey and predict within a certain amount of error how much the behavior frequency would be in that organization? And what we've actually been able to do is find that there is quite a strong overlap between your culture score and whether or not there is a high or low amount of observed unethical behavior in your organization. About 25%, in some cases we've seen up to 30% of the variance in unethical conduct behavior can be accounted for purely by a culture assessment. So this is quite substantial amount that you can actually look at predicting in an organization. And what we notice, of course, is the stronger your ethical culture scores are, the lower the unethical conduct frequency as observed by employees. And you can actually now use regression models and structural equation models to plug in an organization's score on culture and actually predict what its behavior looks like relatively accurately. So this also reduces the cognitive load in actually running all of these assessments in the organization. So something else that we've also noticed, which I think is kind of interesting, is I'm going to share this with you. This is the ethical culture scores obtained with the ethics behavior scores. And what we notice is, as your ethical culture becomes more mature, unethical conduct becomes less. But for a small minority of organizations, it appears that the opposite is true. And what we've noticed is these are organizations that focus heavily on compliance. So there's a point at which values-based ethics starts to take the back seat to a rule-based ethical system. And what we've noticed is that rule-based system reduces unethical conduct. But if you force that system, if you increase compliance beyond a certain threshold, it actually results in increasing unethical conduct. And this is because employees feel cynical about these kinds of rules and such. Colleagues, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, and we can take questions if there are any.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. This is very interesting, especially the assessment at the end of the difference between sort of compliance and culture, ethical culture, the assessment, and where the benefits outweigh some of the costs within those organizations, which is so we have a question from someone asking how you choose the set of organizations to ensure that the ethical maturity score is sort of comparable, and how you use the data there. So maybe you can just give us a really quick overview of how you ensure comparability.
It's ultimately a question about the sample that you're using to ultimately compare your data to. So we are ensuring at the moment, we do these ethics risk assessments in a year and then collect data from these organizations. So we're ultimately expanding that norm sample as much as we can. But so I think the best way to answer it is you should have a good distribution of organizations, both multinationals, private sectors, large, medium. You should have organizations that operate in different state-owned, environments or in public sector environments. And you also need a good spread of those that are bad and good, right, within those environments. And so that is where we are currently at with our norm. And I think it allows us to give a very good idea. But we don't just do that. I think that's a more general norm. There are also ways of going into only a financial sector norm, for example. So you could say, well, let's choose all the banks that are within the system and compare ourselves to those banks and see whether we are better or worse off than they are. The same with tech or many others. So your norm sample really needs to be as wide as possible. And I think that's also where we're catching up at the Ethics Institute. We are now getting a lot more international data, which I think is also going to give us a bit of insight. And we've translated these surveys into numerous languages. And it still retains the same structure and validity. And that's encouraging for us. So I think this could be a tool going forward that could be a quick way of understanding where your ethics risk lies and then, of course, informing you of how to manage and mitigate that risk going forward as an organization managing ethics.
Super, thank you. I think you already answered the next question, but just to clarify, you are also looking both at public sector as well, right? You said state-owned enterprises, but also public sector, so across the board in terms of ethical culture.
That's correct. And very often, especially in South Africa, your state-owned and public sector organizations often don't do as well as private sector organizations regarding culture and conduct. So often people say, well, compare us to our own sector because we have certain demands, political pressures that we have that others don't have in the private sector. So that becomes very useful when you can target it that way, Scarlett. So it can be done, and I think it should be done.